Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. Richard, so first of all, I just want to acknowledge something that our listeners may not be able to appreciate as readily as I can. I am amazed that you are in the middle of a move and juggling various work tasks, no doubt, research, administrative work, moving homes, and raising four children, and you still manage to find time, not just the time, but the peace of mind to discuss philosophy with me. So I first of all marvel at that sort of psychological fact, which really does seem to be a fact. It's something I've noticed about you for a long time now, that almost sort of no matter how much you are in the thick of things, you're able to step outside of them and talk philosophy. So
Yeah,
that's impressive, but also just thank you for making the time and the psychological, spiritual efforts to make that possible.
I guess this all gives me an excuse for poor quality if I'm doing
Yeah,
badly.
right.
Well, but philosophy isn't supposed to be like what we're supposed to be doing in our leisure time optimally, right? If we had all the
Yes.
free time in the world, that's what we would do. And I guess
Wow.
I'm trying to squeeze it out, and it's the best, highest good, right? Or part of it at least.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But is it safe to say that you have leisure time? I mean, like by any
Right, right.
conceivable, are you reading books for fun? Are you watching television? Is there anything you're doing for leisure?
Oh, well, yeah, I try to just squeeze in some books here and there, especially during the summer for leisure.
Yes, absolutely.
Oftentimes they're fiction, like I was trying to read The Lord of the Rings again. Yeah, but most recently I was reading this book by Zena Hitz. It's called
Oh yeah.
Lost in Thought. Have you heard of it?
hmm Yes, I've heard of the book. I've been meaning to read it someday, which is kind of my way of saying I've formed an unstable intention to read it, but yes, I really admire Zena Hitz. I've been following her for a while now, actually since graduate school. Yeah, anyway, that's great to hear.
Yeah, the book is great. And it's really sort of a meditation on just thinking hard about like what is the value of thinking, reflection, philosophy, the
Yeah.
liberal arts, the humanities. And Zena hits, so she of course goes in deeply into her own, past history and her upbringing. When you read it, it's marvelous because she really talks about the love of learning having been implanted into her at a very young age. And she just talks about these books like, the great books in this glowing way where you just see why they're
Yeah.
so beautiful. But when I read it, I also do feel a little bit ashamed, to be honest, because I just didn't, I don't know, this sounds weird to say as a philosopher now, but I didn't really have that kind of love of learning for its own sake until quite
Oh,
late. Maybe it started barely in college at some point.
huh.
And I don't know if that's partly because my parents are immigrants and they tend to instrumentalize things like,
Uh-huh.
they'll say you got to study hard, but well, why? So that you can go to a good college. Well, why go to a good college? Well, so that you can maybe become a medical doctor and make a lot of money. You do wonder where the chain of reasoning ends. But oftentimes it's that kind of
Because,
instrumental
by the
mindset.
way, making money is also just an instrumental good, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I would hope. That's definitely not a proper end. That's right. But oftentimes, like I think immigrants, they do tend to prize stability and
Yes, of course.
accumulation of wealth because
Yeah.
oftentimes they might be coming from a poor background, so it makes sense. But at the
Yeah,
end
it's
of the
understandable.
day, yeah. So money is of course important, and stability and is material goods are necessary. But I think philosophers, we do tend to appreciate this thought that knowledge is valuable for its own sake, that
Yeah.
thinking, philosophizing, reading, these are, and other practical goods like friendship as well, these are non-instrumentally valuable.
Yeah.
So, Justin, I was wondering, like, about your background. Like, when do you think, at what
Oh,
point did you come to appreciate thinking and philosophy as valuable for its own sake?
that's an interesting question. Let me just start by saying I don't doubt in any meaningful sense that philosophical reflection and reflection in general, the kind that we associate with reflection on literature, even movies and that kind of thing in the liberal arts, has a great deal of inherent or non-instrumental value. So it just, in terms of reporting on my own impressions and my own personal experience, it just feels to me like my life is greatly enriched by thought and reflection. Of course, I have a horse in this race. I have a vested interest in saying so because I'm peddling this stuff, philosophy to people, but it just comports with my personal experience and with the experience of the students that I see who for, at least for the ones where I somehow managed to turn on a light for them, seems like they feel the same. So I really do believe, without having read Zena Hitz's book, I do at least buy that much of her sort of argument, or the conclusion maybe that she's arguing for. And then my experience, first of all, let me just say, if I came to a new country under very uncertain circumstances, I could absolutely see how I would prize in myself and in my family and also in my children stability and sort of job security. I can understand where your parents are coming from. Anquangan, they call it in Chinese, this sort of
Mm.
sense of peace and stability,
Mhm.
security. And yet I was, I guess, pretty privileged because I had parents that were somewhere on the kind of the, not the far edge, but like the middle of the hippie spectrum. And
Mhm.
so they had these views about education, or at least it seemed to me that I was not a very good student in elementary school and certainly middle school when I became obsessed with being cool and getting along with peers and kind of avoiding bullying and just I had all these distractions in middle school and I wasn't a very good student then. They got on my case because they wanted to make sure that I was at least employable. But then in high school, my interests in academic stuff or scholarly stuff really took off. And I had some good role models, and I was, reading the collection of great books that my parents had, or trying to read them, not really understanding them very well. But I would say actually, as early as high school, I was already kind of pursuing my own scholarly or academic muses in my choice of courses. So I suppose there were times that I was thinking instrumentally, oh, I have to take physics in order to pass or graduate. But for the most part, I was choosing courses that I thought were inherently interesting. And my experience has been that the benefits in terms of sort of your ability to learn the material are enormous when you find the stuff that you're studying inherently interesting. You're just
Mhm.
much more likely to digest the materials and integrate it into kind of a big picture or worldview. And in retrospect, I sort of see myself as when I go all the way back to high school and I think of my history classes, my philosophy classes, and even my kind of leisure activities, reading pulp fiction and fantasy novels and that sort of thing, is all feeding into one master project. And that master project was building a worldview and maybe even developing a sense of competing worldviews that might compete with it. And now, of course, I realize that our memories are very selective and that they're in part informed by these narratives that we tell. So they have a narrative structure that's superimposed on them. So I'm sure that the story wasn't actually as neat and as tidy as that. But
Mhm.
I do remember, taking a course in Russian history in high school. And I think I was obsessed with the implications of Russian history for thinking about big sort of East-West issues. That was one of the frameworks that they used back then. And also thinking a lot about politics and political theory, political philosophy. So
Mhm.
yeah, my experience is somewhat different from yours, and I say it with so much, how do I put it? I mean, I just feel, a little bit too privileged because I haven't had to worry that much about. I mean, of course, like everyone else, when I was getting my PhD, I fretted constantly about being able to actually make a living
Mhm.
and get a
Mhm.
job as a teacher of philosophy. But up until then, I didn't actually pause very long to think about whether the stuff that I was studying was going to be useful towards some further
Mhm.
end or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely nothing to feel ashamed about. The privilege, I mean, in a way, although I guess it's tough. Like, obviously, we're both very privileged now, and in a way,
Hmm.
to be able to have the leisure and to be able to read just fascinating stuff and reflect on them. I mean, there's still huge swaths of human beings all over the world that are struggling to meet their material needs. Yeah, it is sometimes a bit troubling. I think anyone with somewhat of a conscience who thinks about things from a global perspective are troubled, when there are places that are doing so desperately or doing so badly and people
Yeah.
with such desperate needs. On the other hand, like I guess like it is good to also still appreciate that there are these like the life of the mind, these amazing works of literature and also like music, right? I started
Yeah.
listening to Charles Mingus, so I've been trying to get into jazz,
Wow.
and just because, yeah, like I've always appreciated a little bit, but I felt like I was missing out, and so I've been really listening to Charles Mingus a lot and Sonny Rollins, and it's just incredible. I mean, it
Yeah.
opens up a whole new world, and I'm not listening to jazz so that I could write another philosophy paper or something like that.
Yes.
It's, I mean, that'd be a weird and something would be kind of off if someone, tried to give instrumental justifications of that sort with like
Yeah.
music or art or poetry or friendship. That'd be even more troubling, maybe. Yeah, so there are these like what we might
Yeah.
call final goods or non-instrumental goods that are
Yeah.
just worth pursuing for their own sake. And really, I think the beauty of life is contained in the realization of those kinds of goods, not instrumental goods, but these, intrinsically valuable, worthwhile goods. And yeah, like it is troubling that some people are just struggling to feed themselves. And so we should be thinking about how we might help them. But even there, we're hoping that their material circumstance can be improved so that they can also
Yeah.
realize these deep, human goods that I think everyone should have access to.
Yeah. That's a very Aristotelian and Confucian way of seeing it, especially Confucian, I would say, insofar as we
Yeah.
want these for everyone, these
Hmm.
goods. Yeah, well, Richard, I'm a little bit surprised that you see yourself as a latecomer because as long as I've known you, it's been so effortless. I mean, I still remember when I first came to Hong Kong, you were a postdoc there. I think I had about a week as a visitor at the Center for Comparative and East Asian Philosophy at City University, where you were a postdoc. And we it just felt like effortless. It was so easy to slip into philosophical discussion with you.
Well, at that
And
time, I've come to appreciate it in a deeper way, but it had taken me quite a while. I mean, certainly maybe toward the end of college, I kept thinking I'm just going to go to law school and
yeah.
then try to make a lot of money. That's what I kept telling my mom. But something at some point, like I just realized if I can I mean, first of all, I just realized doing philosophy is just so amazing. I just wasn't sure if I can
Yeah.
feed myself doing it. And I worried about that, just
Yeah.
like you mentioned as well. Yeah, but I don't know. I think we've talked about this many times now, but I do marvel at the fact that we can both do this, for a living. It's just
Yeah.
incredible. And so when you pointed out, how do I make time, for the podcast? And first of all, we're doing philosophy here, right? And
Yeah.
it's
That's true.
such a rich activity. And also, of course, my wife, Shui Ying, who's a scholar herself, appreciates it. And so she's extremely supportive, although she has her own career and she has to be with the 4 kids right now as I
Yeah.
speak.
Thank you,
But
Shane. Yeah. Yeah.
she's always like, "Oh, you're recording again? Good." In fact, I think at one point we didn't record for a little while, maybe a few weeks, and she was like, "When are you doing the recording?" And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think she enjoys the fact that we engage in these what I think are interesting, rich conversations
Yeah.
and do some philosophy.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for Shay's support. I can tell that she's sort of making it possible for us in all kinds of ways, psychologically and in terms of like childcare. And let me just add that she is a really impressive scholar. I've talked to her over email recently about her impressions of the show, and I can tell she's listening really closely and
Mhm.
as thoughtfully. Yeah, just something to mention that Richard's spouse is a scholar in her own right and doing a very interesting paper on Daigen now, actually,
That's right. And
Christian
she's been
account.
getting help from you because you've really studied. I mean, in fact, wasn't your dissertation on Daigen?
Yes,
Is
it
that
was.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So
In my
she's been
next.
telling me she's been helped by you a lot in reading your works.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, this is a nice topic to have landed on, I guess, because it gives us a chance to talk about our past a little bit and also what motivates us now. Yeah, I'll just underscore again, I don't have any doubts really, except in the sort of radical moments of doubt that we all have, that it's tremendously enriching the stuff that we do for its own sake. And so even if we weren't recording, it would be wonderful to talk with you on a regular basis. I feel like we have one announcement to make before you give a little preface to today's topic. And that announcement is sponsors. We actually have our first ever sponsor. It's like a historic moment for us. And that sponsor is the Hong Kong Ethics Lab. It's a kind of academic unit offshoot of my own department, the philosophy department of the University of Hong Kong. I just have to say that my new department, my old one was really wonderful. And the new one is both wonderful, dynamic, just like the other one, but also has lots of resources. It's an exciting time to be there. And I'm very grateful for their support. They're looking for ways of bringing ethics to a larger audience, even in public facing ways, And so they thought the podcast was well worth supporting for precisely that reason. So we will put a link to the Hong Kong Ethics Lab in the show notes, and we thank them from the bottom of our hearts for their support. They're not paying us. We're not getting any salary or anything. They're just helping defray some of the costs of the podcast. And
Yep.
Some. So if anyone else out there wants to support us, of course, we would welcome it too.
We would not decline.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So today's topic is one mindful of the fact that Richard is in the middle of a big move of his house and doing lots of things. We thought we would just pick a topic that we both felt like we could just hit the ground running and discuss without a lot of preparation. And that one is the golden rule. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the golden rule and the related concept of empathy. And as usual, this is going to connect up with one or two passages we would like to focus on in today's discussion.
Yeah, so the golden rule, of course, perhaps people in the West are more familiar with it. I mean,
Yeah.
you find it in Judeo-Christian traditions. I'm sure it also comes out in the Islamic tradition as well in some form, but perhaps the most famous formulation I think you find in the Gospels in the New Testament with
Yeah.
Jesus saying something like, do unto others as you'd want them do unto you. And we also find a formulation of the golden rule, although it'll be interesting to kind of compare the formulation, but in the Analects of Confucius, and it's sometimes characterized as the one doctrine of Confucius, for example,
Yeah.
in Analects 15.24, or as one half of the single thread that runs through Confucius's way, or the complete teaching in the Analects 4.15. So the golden
Yeah.
rule is certainly plays a very important role in Confucius's thought and within Confucianism as a tradition. Although exactly what role and what it amounts to, I think needs some clarification. So hopefully we can provide that today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's mentioned explicitly in actually a number of passages, but in two passages in particular, it's mentioned in a way that suggests that it's fundamental, that it's some kind of through line or some kind of unifying theme of the way that Confucius is teaching. So in Analects 4:15, that where the single thread passage, as you called it rightly, Richard, Confucius says to one of his students, "My way has a single thread running through it," and then he leaves the room, and his student, who's the later tradition holds to be very wise, Zhuangzi, says the single thread are these two things. One kind of virtue or virtuous attitude known as conscientiousness or loyalty, and the other one is this sympathetic concern or care, which is often cashed out as a practice of the golden rule, not doing to others what you would not want done to yourself. And then the other passage you mentioned is 15:24, which we'll call the one doctrine passage. And that's where Confucius says, or a student asks Confucius, if there's one doctrine that a person could take with them and follow throughout their lives, what would it be? And he says it's this thing shu, which is often translated as sympathetic concern, empathy, sometimes reciprocity. But then he goes on to define it, or at least give a kind of rule, it seems like, for how one practices it, which is that which you do not want for yourself, do not inflict or impose on others. So yeah, because the text goes out of its way to say this is the one doctrine or the one part of the one thread, that's always made readers sit up and pay attention and think that, here is something that's really not just one rule or one insight or one behavioral norm or rule of decision procedure, among others, but a really important one. So the later Confucian tradition is just like us. When they see statements like those, they sit up and pay attention as well. So the later Confucian tradition is rich in fine-grained analysis of these passages. And so we were thinking, not only would the golden rule be a kind of a keystone for us to discuss in the Confucian way, in the way of Confucius himself, the classical Confucian philosopher, but also a stepping stone for later Confucian philosophy. So I have this sort of pet hypothesis about the origins of kind of philosophy I'm really interested in. One of my pet hypotheses is that basically it always arises out of a period of pluralism when people are entertaining lots of competing views and kind of shopping around for worldviews. And I think that's borne out by the so-called Warring States period philosophical scene, which is sometimes called the Hundred Schools period. Lots of pluralism, lots of different schools of thought. My other hypothesis is that really good philosophy comes from close reading. This one I think is more controversial. So I tend to think that you see people arriving at really interesting, subtle, nuanced positions about things when they are clearly spending lots of time parsing sentences, looking at the word choice, reading classical stories or arguments or what have you, dialogues, and spending a lot of time thinking about why did so-and-so say this and not this, So what scholars sometimes now call close readings are really an essential part of philosophy as a kind of robust philosophical tradition. And the later Confucian tradition, especially so-called Neo-Confucianism, or what outside of Anglophone context we sometimes call Songming Li Xue, Songming, sort of Confucian study of pattern or principle, that tradition, which is really interesting and philosophically rich, basically arises out of close readings of the Analect. One of the reasons it's so interesting is because they spend a lot of time arguing about these passages. So some of the questions that motivate them to develop very distinctive views are, questions like, in what sense is the golden rule fundamental for Confucius's way? Is it like the means that we must all adopt in order to eventually achieve sagehood or certain important virtues? Or is it like an ingredient of sagehood? Is it like something that, or the virtues? Is it just the ladder that we climb and then kick away if we can? Or is it somehow an important constituent of everything that we do, even when we're fully virtuous people? They also like to argue about, whether thoughts about the self really should enter in to one's decision making in the way that the golden rule seems to suggest. This is an interesting kind of quirky thing that doesn't appear in other discussions of golden rule, I think, for example, in Western philosophy, but it's very distinctive and interested in kind of becomes a whole sort of new avenue or venue for theorizing in the later Confucian tradition. The golden rule, as Confucius formulates it, suggests that you're supposed to think, okay, what would I not want? Okay, I don't want that, so I won't inflict it on others, right? And that kind of thought about the self as someone separate from the other person that you're caring for and just worries about what's in your interest and that sort of thing. Could that perhaps in some way inhibit more virtuous states or ideals of character, like humaneness understood as forming one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things? So anyway, is there a danger of ego creeping in, that kind of stuff? So anyway, the point is there's lots of interesting theory that develops and arises out of close readings of these passages. This is going to be our excuse to do that.
Yeah, as you were talking about close reading and how the close reading of the text, especially the Analects, and parsing the sentences and trying to really grasp how certain terms were being used and in what context, it reminded me of, so I don't know if you've known many Wittgensteinians, but
Yeah.
they talk all the time about the grammatical method. I don't
Yeah.
know if you're familiar with that, but a big part of that whole methodology is really understanding how language is used and also, yeah, knowing how concepts are deployed in certain contexts, which they think help reveal truth about human life and practice and so on. They also think that paying very close attention to the way words are being used within the context of human life, the sorts of sentences we utter, and the sense and meaning behind the terms and the sentences will help reveal deep philosophical truths. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I wonder if anyone's ever noted that kind of or written on that.
Yeah. Right. Well, I did get my PhD at the University of Chicago. There are lots of Wittgensteinians there, and there was something called the Wittgenstein Workshop. When I attended it in the first quarter or so, I quickly dropped out. But back then, they were reading Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations extremely slowly, like,
Yep.
uh, I mean, I think it would have taken them years to finish the.
Well, there's also a lot of Straussians, right? I mean, we don't want to get
Yes.
into weeds, but at the University of Chicago, so I'm sure you were also
Yes.
exposed to the need for close reading from the Straussians
Yes.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Straussians have a certain approach to political philosophy and reading of political philosophy also are big believers in close readings, especially of Plato. I still remember. Yeah, and for what it's worth, sometimes people think that academics read a little too closely, like they're too quick to read messages or insights into a text that may not actually be there. I'm mindful of that worry, so I worry especially about superimposing anachronistic, ideas on old texts. But nevertheless, I do want to say that in general, these old texts that we discuss on our podcast, the classical Chinese texts, were meant to be read very closely. Most of them were written at a time when people wrote, basically, carved these characters into bamboo strips, and you couldn't fit much text into a bundle of bamboo strips. And they weren't meant to be very long passages. They were meant to be taught, memorized, mulled over, discussed with the master, with the teacher very carefully in some of the ways that
Hmm.
are emulated by later traditional commentaries. So,
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that they oftentimes, not always, the close reading and speculation about the careful word choice and that sort of thing is warranted.
Hmm.
Yeah, so, well, this is all the more reason to plunge in and discuss these pivotal passages on the Golden Rule
Hmm.
and the related topic of empathy, which we'll discuss that and so much more actually after the break. So we are talking about the Golden Rule, and of course, we're talking about a couple of passages that make reference to the Golden Rule, but we're also going to talk about a kind of more general, sometimes it's called an emotion, sometimes it's called an emotional attitude. Maybe it's just an attitude or even a kind of decision-making process that we call empathy. And I think here I should just kind of make a disclaimer and say, we're going to use this word empathy in a very specific sense. It's broadly understood to refer to many different psychological phenomena. And so are these other words that are kind of in the same semantic neighborhood as empathy, sympathy, compassion, pity. Those are all in the same neighborhood. But we're just going to use it, I think, in a specific sense. And let me try this out on you, Richard. In order to get at what the Confucians, especially these later Confucians that I'm interested in, mean when they talk about the role of certain emotional attitudes and processes in developing benevolence or humane care for other people, I think what we need is a psychological phenomenon that refers to two things. First, perspective taking. So, what I mean by perspective taking is basically whatever it is that you, the listener, have in mind when you hear this phrase, put yourself in someone else's shoes. Some people cash that out in terms of taking up someone else's point of view, right? Some people cash it out in terms of a vicarious experience of someone else's thoughts and feelings. Some people cash it out in terms of sort of simulation of other people's psychological states. Some people say you reconstruct their experience in your imagination. However you choose to cash it out, that's what I have in mind. Sometimes psychologists refer to it as role taking. Maybe that will help. So that's one important feature of empathy. But another important feature that I want to be sure to capture here is care. That is actual care, concern for, I don't know, the interests, the well-being of people, presumably other people, the people you're trying to empathize with. And you might think, well, don't those two things just go hand in hand? And the answer is no, they don't. I mean, you can do a lot of imagining of what it's like to be someone else from their point of view without caring about them. We do that when we read novels. Obviously, quite naturally, you drift toward caring about the people whose points of view you're reconstructing or imagining, but not always. Martha Nussbaum makes a good example of a sadistic torturer who seems to, it's really important for him to imagine the pain that other people are going through, but clearly it's not care that motivates him to torture people. So that's a kind of empathy without care. Anyway, so if you just bear in mind that it's perspective taking plus care, I think you'll have the right sort of psychological phenomenon in mind as we proceed.
Hmm. Or I guess sometimes people might say it combines both empathy and sympathy in the sense that
Yeah,
you're combining both
both perspective taking plus
experiencing,
care. Yeah.
right, and experiencing. Nowadays, also, sometimes people do distinguish cognitive and
Yeah.
maybe emotional empathy, but I guess both are included in this case, right? So both feelings and thoughts. Yeah.
Right. So some of the paradigm cases that tend to come up in discussions of empathy, the virtues that have to do with perspective taking in the Confucian context, will be about reconstructing what other people desire. And I tend to imagine that as having both cognitive and conative aspects. So, I think when you're imagining what someone else would want, you're in some sense kind of simulating the things that they want. It's thinking, oh gosh, I'd be so upset about that. I'd want to change that, or I'd be so sad and feel so regretful that this happened. At the same time, you'd also be making judgments about what it is that they want. And that seems to me like the cognitive side. Yeah, so we're going to focus on two short passages from the Analects, the book that is usually seen as kind of the authoritative recording of the sayings of Confucius or Kongzi. And these are both passages that seem to make reference to some variant of the Golden Rule. And because I'm particularly interested in how later Confucian philosophers read the Analects, I'm going to distinguish between these two passages in ways that would be friendly to these later Neo-Confucian philosophers. So, according to the later Confucian philosophers, as we will see, there is a distinction to be made between the way ordinary people empathize, people like me, I'm no master of virtue. I'm no a moral paragon. And the way that sages empathize, people who are fully virtuous. We don't even have to say sages. Sages are kind of fully virtuous and then some, also influential and have a certain charismatic effect on others. Just anyone who's fully virtuous. There's a way in which fully virtuous people empathize that is well captured by this Confucian virtue of ren, sometimes translated as humaneness, sometimes as benevolence, sometimes as goodness. And then there's a way that ordinary people often find themselves having to empathize, which in the classical Chinese texts is often referred to as shu. It's for people of speakers of modern Chinese, it's rao shu de shu. It's the shu that people often nowadays associate with kind of forgiveness or grace or that sort of thing, giving someone clemency. But in the classical text, there's a sense of the term that predates the clemency sense of the term that we now associate with modern shu, where it just means something like empathizing or empathetic concern. So anyway, the point is we're going to look at two passages, one which, according to the later tradition, represents how ordinary people empathize, and the other which, according to the later tradition, represents how sages empathize. So we'll call the first one the classic Golden Rule passage. This is the one passage that everyone who has ever talked about the Golden Rule in the context of Confucianism knows. It's Analects 1524, for those of you who like the numbers. 15, we'll call it chapter 24. Again, that's the classic one, describes ordinary empathizing. And then we're going to get another passage that we'll call the Golden Rule for Sages passage, and that's Analects 630. Yeah, so we'll start with the classic version, classic formulation.
Okay, so, all right, so just a classic formulation of the Golden Rule. Zigong asked, is there one teaching that can serve as a guide for one's entire life? The master answered, is it not sympathetic understanding, or in Chinese, shu? Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire.
Exactly. So it's short and sweet. It introduces this character shu, which I mentioned earlier, and it gives us either a definition or maybe more likely a kind of description of the decision procedure that you're supposed to follow if you want to instantiate this thing. Shu. Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire.
It is also worth pointing out that it does differ from the Christian or the Jesus formulation of the Golden Rule.
Yes.
Because in the Jesus formulation in the New Testament, he says, do unto others what you want others to do to you. Whereas here, I guess this is why sometimes people call it the negative Golden Rule.
Yeah, the silver rule.
Silver rule? Yeah. So I'm not sure what's better. But here, it does seem like, it's interestingly different. I'm not sure off the top of my head, like how exactly it'll be cashed out or what the differences will be.
Yeah. Over the years, I've heard there is, among scholars who work on the Golden Rule, they sometimes distinguish between the Golden Rule and the Silver Rule, otherwise known as the Negative Golden Rule. And occasionally I'll even speak with scholars who think that there's some significance in the fact that Kongzi, Confucius, formulates it negatively. Sometimes people suggest it means he's kind of interested in a more permissive picture of how you can live your life. You just have to worry about what other people don't desire. You don't have to worry so much about what they do desire.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I'm not so sure that's why he formulated it negatively. I mean, it seems to me that in the Confucian tradition generally, and also in the Analects, he thinks there's a lot to be gained by imagining what people do desire. And then another point that I'll steal from, I think it's David Nivison, who's written a lot on Chinese philosophy, is that there's a sense in which whether it's formulated in the positive or the negative way doesn't really matter. There are two different ways of describing the same sorts of end states or objects of desire. So I can't remember what his example is, but one example for me is like, never tell a lie, It's like the object of my desire is never to be lied to, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is to say that I want it to be the case that when people speak to me, they always either tell me the truth or refrain from speaking. And those two options are essentially the same. As objects of desire, I want the same thing, whether I happen to formulate it positively or negatively. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. I mean, it may be true that in fact, like in practice, when people emphasize what it is that they don't desire, they're trying to carve out a more permissive space for action, that they're trying to make possible for people to accept more things. But it's a good point, nonetheless, that there's a sense in which maybe not all that much, on a strict reading, not all that much should depend on whether it's formulated positively or negatively.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's the first passage, the classical Golden Rule passage. The second one, the golden rule for sages, Analects 630, goes as follows. By the way, it's interesting that it's the same student that's speaking with Confucius here. Zigong. Someday we'll probably have an episode just on the disciples of Confucius and what we know about them and how they were understood. Zigong is a very talented student, not a star student, but among the elite. And it was said that he spoke multiple dialects and was a good merchant, became a diplomat, sort of, good at something like international relations. Anyway, so here's Zigong asking a question about the most important virtue, humaneness, or ren. If there were one who was able to bestow much upon the common people and bring succor to the multitudes, what would you make of him? Could such a person be called humane? And the master responds, why stop at humane? Such a person could surely be called a sage. Even someone like Yao or Shun, who are famous sage kings in history, would find such a task daunting. And then here's the key part. Desiring to take his stand, one who is humane helps others to take their stand. Wanting to realize himself, he helps others to realize themselves. Being able to take what is near at hand as an analogy could perhaps be called the method of humaneness. By the way, we've just slightly modified Edward Slingerland's translations of the Analects, but we'll, of course, post a link to that source, his translation. Yeah, so let me just stop here and call attention to one little bit of text. I'll read again the key part of the Golden Rule for Sages passage. Desiring to take his stand, one who is humane helps others to take their stand. Wanting to realize himself, he helps others to realize themselves. So he goes on, being able to take what is near at hand as an analogy could perhaps be called the method of humaneness. So there's sort of two claims here. First of all, one is there's a kind of golden rule-like formulation about how the humane person conducts themselves, And then the second is there's this thing that describes what he calls the method of humaneness, taking what is near at hand as an analogy. The idea, maybe I'm just stating the obvious here, is like you yourself want to take a stand, which is to say, establish yourself in society, get a job, get public recognition as an adult and respected member of the society. And so you want for other people to do the same, right? That's a kind of analogy. The concern for other people's ability to take their stand is going to depend on all kinds of analogical thinking. You're going to have to think about how their life is similar to yours, how their interests are similar to yours, how certain interests are sort of higher priorities for them, just as they are for you. All that is something like analogical thinking. But according to the later tradition, and this is something that not many people know, according to the Neo-Confucians, there's actually a distinction being made here. Desiring to take your stand and thus wanting someone else to take their stand, wanting to realize yourself and thus wanting someone else to realize themselves, that's a description of humaneness, according to the Neo-Confucians, the full virtue of humaneness or goodness or benevolence. But as for this thing that they call the method of humaneness, being able to take what is near at hand as an analogy, according to the later tradition, that's not actual humaneness. That's the means by which you acquire humaneness. So the Chinese is 人之方, that's what's being translated as method of humaneness. It's tempting to read it as saying, this is how you enact or instantiate humaneness, right? But according to the later tradition, no, that's not right. It's how you become humane. It's the method by which you eventually acquire humaneness. It's not actually humaneness itself. You should stop relying on this method once you become humane because it should come more naturally or easily. All right, so yeah, those are the two passages. And yeah, I don't know if you want to talk briefly about the significance of the Golden Rule and these passages in the context of the Analects itself or classical Confucianism, or if we just want to move directly to the Neo-Confucian readings of them. But I'm happy to talk about both. I guess I should just mention briefly that there is some controversy about how central the historical Confucius really saw the Golden Rule as being for his thought. So Brian Van Norden, who comes up often, has written an article arguing that this passage, not this passage so much, but the one that the so-called single thread passage, which talks about shu, sympathetic understanding or empathy, and this other key attitude known as loyalty or conscientiousness, that passage doesn't really look like a very typical one for the Analects. Confucius is behaving a bit like a Buddhist master and, just dropping hints and leaving it to his students to figure out what the esoteric teachings are. And so anyway, I just want to sort of flag this as an issue, that not everyone's on board with this idea that it's a fundamental doctrine or idea in the text.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of a puzzle here. So if we go back to the classical Golden Rule passage in which Confucius the master says that the one teach is perhaps sympathetic understanding or shu, and the formulation of it is do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire.
Yeah,
In that last sentence, do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. There's no perspective taking identified
right.
there. I mean, there at least, where's the perspective taking?
Yeah, right. That's good. Yeah, so on a strict reading of this golden rule as formulated in the classical passage, classical GR passage, Analects 1524, it could just be understood as a decision procedure, like you're trying to decide whether you should comfort a friend, we'll call her Xiao Huang, when she loses her job, And so you think to yourself, now, what do I desire from my friends? And you kind of like, I don't know, you consult the catalog of your desires and you say, ah, yes, when I'm down, I want my friends to support me, to console me, to comfort me, distract me. And so then you think, okay, having established that, I will now go console and distract and comfort my friend Xiao Huang. That's one way of reading it. But in fact, most of the tradition just assumes that some kind of perspective taking has to be taking place here. They use this
Mhm.
word "tui," which in modern Chinese, it's associated with inference. It's also just the word that you use to say push, like if you're looking at a door at a commercial building and trying to figure out whether you're supposed to push or pull, it'll
Mhm.
say "tui" if you're supposed to push. So anyway, they use this word again and again to suggest that some kind of inferential work is going on that is helping project yourself into the minds or the perspectives or the points of view of other people. So, and I think it's actually a relatively reasonable assumption. I mean, there might be times where you can consult the catalog of your desires without actually imagining yourself in someone else's position. But I think that
Mhm.
in some sense that we might call historical, like every case where you're able to kind of correctly judge how much pain it might cause someone to lose their job or how much happiness it might cause them to have some sort of success or achievement, that's going to be based on some prior either personal experience with a similar situation or imagining of yourself in a similar situation. So it's a really interesting issue. And I actually, in some of my writing, I've called attention to it too, Richard, that like there's a way of reading it just as a decision procedure without any perspective taking. But the tradition does tend to see it as requiring perspective taking.
Mhm. Yeah, and also, I mean, generally the Confucian tradition is, I thought, it tends to be more focused on becoming a really good person, cultivating the virtues, these good character,
Yeah.
as opposed to offering very specific rules for action.
Yes.
Um, so I was also wondering if one way to think about the golden rule in both the classical and the golden rule for sages passage in both passages that we just talked about or we just read. Yeah, if there's a way of thinking about it still as fitting into that kind of what we might call the virtue-based framework or virtue ethical framework, where we're still
Uh,
focusing on cultivation of a good character and kind of certain qualities of a person as opposed to more like a decision procedure, which does seem less
oh,
central to the Confucian sort of emphasis.
okay. Yes. This is a good thing to bear in mind. If you do a lot of ethics nowadays in the 21st century, then you're probably accustomed to thinking of ethics as being about rules of behavior. And it's often said, I think for relatively good reasons, that the Confucian tradition isn't so concerned with specific rules of behavior. It's more concerned with good character. And a variety of reasons for that. So, good character, like having virtuous character traits, wisdom, benevolence, and so on, maybe some courage, righteousness. And once you have those character traits, well, maybe you'll have some rules of thumb, some general rules of behavior that you should follow, but not always. You'll presumably have the judgment to recognize when you follow those rules and when you don't. And so, if that's one way of reading the Confucian tradition that seems warranted, and I think it's certainly reasonable to think it is, then you would be surprised that to be looking at the golden rule at all, because it seems the golden rule does seem like it's meant to be action guiding in some way. It's supposed to tell you what you're supposed to do. So it does seem like rules of behavior are somehow the aim of the golden rule. But yeah, I agree with you, Richard, that maybe the way that's more consistent or compatible with the Confucian tradition more generally, of reading this passage is maybe just as something like a reminder of what you ought to do when you're figuring out exactly how you should behave in a specific situation. It's not the only thing you're supposed to do. It's not fully determinative of the correct course of action. So if you like spicy foods, to use one example from Lao Tzu, a 20th century new Confucian scholar, you love spicy foods. You don't go out and assume everyone else wants as much spicy food as possible. It's not like that at
Mhm.
all. It's just one step that you're supposed to enact in order to bring about the desired psychological state, which is to imagine things from other people's perspective, figure out what it is that they want or don't want.
Yeah, because I guess one worry was that, like, strictly speaking, I mean, people raise these objections to the golden rule generally. Not that it's like inherently like a bad kind of rule, but more like there are specific cases in which it just doesn't seem to work. So,
Yeah.
like, yeah, the spicy food case, maybe your kid needs to study, but I mean, maybe you didn't like studying, but it's still maybe good to,
Yeah.
require your kid to study. Or I think another example, and I think someone else, another moral philosopher, cited this example where it's like the punishment for a crime. I mean, you wouldn't want to be punished for a crime you committed,
Yes.
but that
Right.
doesn't mean that therefore this principle shows that, oh, you should never punish anyone ever, because after all, who wants to go to jail or something like, or be
Right.
fined? But that doesn't sound right.
Yes, right. So I think there are a couple things we can say in response to that. So one is that if you're looking for a very explicit or fully determinative decision procedure that provides you with a definite course of action to follow, the golden rule is supposed to be helpful. It's supposed to be sort of minimally action guiding in the sense that it's going to help you rule out some really wildly bad courses of action. But it's not supposed to be fully determinative. There are other things that you do. You apply your own good judgment and that kind of thing. The other thing is that your examples, Richard, of someone who doesn't want to study or who wants to evade, avoid consequences for committing a crime, those are examples of what I call a kind of more general problem of defective desires. And for what it's worth, Zhu Xi, who is the main Neo-Confucian, the main Neo-Confucian in two senses. First of all, he's the most influential Neo-Confucian in history. And second of all, he's the one that we're going to be focusing on, especially in our discussion of empathy and golden rule thinking today. So he anticipates this defective desires problem. That's a passage in a very rarely read, really cool text known as the Sishu Huowen, Some Questions on the Four Books. And it's where like he tackles with some really difficult questions that his students no doubt brought up again and again at greater length than he does in other texts. Anyway, in that passage, he says something like, well, most ordinary practitioners of Shu, of course, aren't going to have a full grasp of the relevant moral or ethical norms that he calls patterns or principles, Li. So he says, if there are some patterns or principles that we do not understand and our heart minds are not fully rectified, then that which we desire will not necessarily be that which we should desire. And that which we detest will not necessarily be that which we should detest. So he goes on to say, basically, you have to examine things, you have to study these ethical norms. If you go on and hastily just use your desires exactly as you find them, then even if you're sort of intend to do well and be kind to others and that sort of thing, your actions are still going to be self-serving insofar as you're kind of superimposing on them desires that they may not actually have and that aren't good desires in the first place.
Mhm.
So even Joshi, in there, he seems to make it pretty clear that there's some idealization of the agent is being presupposed
Mhm.
when we use
Okay.
the golden rule. We're not just talking about your desires exactly as you find them, but desires that like more enlightened or informed you might have, you know?
Although, is that part of the process of applying the golden rule then? I mean, that starts getting
Yeah.
pretty tricky then. I mean, it seems less and less practical if
Yeah.
you have to idealize.
Yeah, it's a good question. So when Jushi gives us that particular response, when he says, you have to assume some idealization of the agent, he seems to be operating in what I think of as sort of a garbage in, garbage out principle. So if you have garbage desires to start with, then when you're imagining what other people want, you're going to impose your garbage desires on them. You'll
Right.
imagine them wanting to avoid consequences for their crimes or avoid studying or what have you. And then there's this still later Neo-Confucian, the one that I'm probably most obsessed with. He's not a Neo-Confucian in the strict sense because he's doesn't like the heavy-handed metaphysics, but he's definitely a later Confucian responding to Buddhism. So he's a Neo-Confucian in that kind of loose sense. His name is Dai Chen, 18th century guy, Qing. And he, I think, basically assumes that shu, golden rule thinking or kind of ordinary empathy, is supposed to provide us with a technique, a method, a tool that even non-ideal decision makers and agents can take advantage of. So he has to, as I read Daijen, he basically thinks, yes, it's one way of improving your clarity about which desires really matter when you adopt someone else's point of view and imagine how they see things. So he actually kind of rejects this presupposition that with golden rule thinking and with this kind of simplistic or ordinary empathy, it's always garbage in, garbage out. He thinks that actually the very process of imagining yourself in someone else's shoes and figuring out what they want helps you to sort of highlight or focus on the right desires, the desires that really matter, which for him have to do with this thing that he calls life fulfillment. So they have a special connection to life, sheng in Chinese, broadly construed to include survival, reproduction, growth, development, and so on. And I think actually that this guy, later philosopher I mentioned, Dai Zhen, may be right about that. I think that in fact, when we engage in perspective taking, it does have a way of calling attention to the things that really matter. When I sort of see myself or see my own behavior through the eyes of someone else or imagine someone else behaving or wanting as I do, I can start to see that some of my desires really are superfluous or wrong-headed or what have you.
Hmm.
So anyway, that's an issue. It's not well
Yeah,
developed in the later literature, but it's one that does come up.
that's interesting. Yeah, I was just talking to someone about empathy a week or two ago. She was a graduate of University of Chicago, where you went to. She's a postdoc at University of Chicago now, and I asked her what her dissertation was on, and she said empathy in a phenomenologist named Edith Stein. I don't know if you've heard
Oh,
of Edith Stein, but
I've heard of, but I don't really
she,
know.
I think, was a student of Heidegger, and anyway, she has this book, The Problem of Empathy. So I didn't have too long to talk to this person, although I wish if I did. But when I asked, oh, so what is Edith Stein's basic picture of empathy? And when I asked this question, she said, well, what's most interesting about her view of empathy is that empathy gives you access to knowledge that you otherwise would not have been able to have. Because
Yeah.
through empathy, you get the perspective of another and you gain access to that. So you wouldn't have had that perspective just from yourself. And
Yeah.
so there's certain things that the person would know that maybe emotions and certain cognitive things that you just on your own would never have been able to understand, but you grasp it through the person, through
Yes.
empathy. Yeah, I wonder if I had something like that in mind.
I tend to assume that Daijen did, yes. So I think that he basically thinks of empathy as a kind of ideal perspective to take on someone you care about that you can then use to identify the desires that should matter most for someone that you truly care about, you know? So like let's say you have a friend who's, I don't know, easily upset by trivial things. I'm not sure what, small things like social slights or what have you. And you really want to tell that friend, oh, you should, of course, make sure that people treat you respectfully and so on, insofar as you can. But don't let it bother you so much. Don't let it haunt you and don't constantly mull over it when you're after the conversation or after the party where you felt you were slighted. I think for Daijen, the empathy is actually meant to help both you and your friend better see what really matters for your friend. So there's a sense in which your friend could adopt an empathetic perspective toward herself and help sort of recognize where her real interests lie, where the desires that are rightly connected with what he calls life fulfillment really reside, which ones are those. And I admit, though, that my reading of Daijen is a little controversial. It's just that there are a couple passages where he suggests that there's this thing that he calls humane love of self, and it seems that adopting this virtuous attitude towards oneself, humaneness, is meant to help clarify what's really in your interest and what's not.
So in the case of this very particular example,
Yeah,
so when you take the perspective of your friend who is putting too much weight on these small social slights, so you are through that process of empathy. And so, I mean, what's going on there is that if you take the perspective of your friend and your friend is obviously really triggered, really, irritated, annoyed, and upset
yeah,
by these things that someone said, let's say, yeah. So the next step is, I guess, how do you gain greater knowledge now by
yeah.
taking the perspective of your friend who's overvaluing slights? What's the process there?
So first of all, just I'll set the Chinese philosophers aside. So the philosopher that I think comes closest to having this view is Dai Zhen. And I attribute it to him just because it's the kind of only consistent way to read him, not because he's really articulated it as a clear position. But so as for like the mechanism by which we come to see what really matters for your friend and for you, for that matter, when
Hmm.
you adopt this
Hmm.
point of view, that's a little harder to say, but I suspect it's just something like, well, when you engage in empathizing, when you imagine what someone who cares about you would want for your sake, putting a certain distance between your immediate present desires, motivations, and what we might call like a benevolent or compassionate friends or observers' desires for you on your behalf. So just the fact that you're taking that sort of psychological distance is supposed to help clarify in some ways. But then actually, one thing I can say with a little bit more confidence about Dai Zhen, whose moral psychology has a lot to do with empathy, is that he thinks something about empathy as a natural psychological mechanism necessarily draws upon certain near universal or near universal inclinations or dispositions that we all have. And he thinks that we kind of learn to empathize by building on what he calls the love of life and fear of death. And there are certain desires that have the right relationship to love of life and fear of death, and there are others that do not. So worrying about social slights doesn't have that right connection. But worrying
Hmm.
about what we were talking about in part one of this episode, making sure you have a stable livelihood and have that sort of security that you will have a constant source of food and income and such into the indefinite future. That is something that has the right connection to love of life and fear and death. And sympathy is the way we learn to empathize with others is primarily by seeing that they are living creatures like us who have the same vested interests in not dying and growing up and developing into mature versions of themselves and so on.
Okay, so it does require this kind of grasp of the shared humanity or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is significant. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I must admit, like I'm not entirely sure if I have the full picture, but there's something really important here about this idea that part of our process of moral growth, development, and maturation requires us to kind of expand ourselves by being able to enter into the perspective of others, by being able to, take up their stance and kind of feel what
Hmm.
they feel and understand what they desire and think. It does seem like that is part of, if I think of anyone who's like wise, they are able to do that in a really, significant way. Yeah, that seems right. And actually, I don't know if you've ever taught David Foster Wallace's speech, "This is Water." It's like a favorite for a lot of
I've
liberal arts people.
Yes, I've heard. Yes, but I have not taught
But
it.
at one point in the speech, he says something like, I mean, we tend to be kind of selfish because our own desires and emotions and thoughts and feelings are just right there, you know? It's
Yeah.
like it just hits you. It's the first thing, you know. So it's hard, especially when you're a child, to realize the truth, which is you are just one person. Like the universe isn't literally centered around you. And it really takes quite a bit of development, maybe the right social environment and the right teaching from good
Yeah.
people to help you to recognize that no, those other kids that maybe you made fun of, they can feel pain and embarrassment. And so they have a real emotional life. And that is like so crucial for moral development.
Yeah.
I feel like this is all sort of wrapped together in that process.
Absolutely. I think that's right. So there's some sense in which you're not even getting off the ground in terms of your own moral development until you've begun to suspend your own point of view and figure out how the world must seem to other people. And when I say how the world must seem, I mean, what they care about, how things look to them, like what's important, what's not. And so one interesting thing about the Confucian tradition is it seems like they recognize that right from the start. It's interesting if you read a lot about the ethics of empathy and care and sympathy. A lot of times you'll see scholars say, well, empathy itself was a term that, came from the German thinker.
Einfühlung.
Yeah, Einfühlung, yeah, and feeling with, I guess,
Mhm.
is the way to translate it. And there was this thing, sympathy beforehand, they say, but that was understood broadly. It didn't necessarily presuppose perspective taking. So they kind of speak as if empathy is this sort of new invention, relatively recent, I don't know, late modern invention in Western thought. But it's quite clear that some sort of attitude that closely resembles what we call empathy now runs through the Confucian tradition. And for lots of reasons. It's not just the reasons we'll discuss today. My experience, by the way, is similar to yours, Richard. I've written, I'd say, 2.5 papers on empathy and sympathy and Confucianism, and 2.5 because the third one borrows heavily from the first two. It was an attempt to kind of clarify some of my views from the first two. And my view is that, like, even after writing these papers, I'm still just seeing various parts of the elephant, and it takes a while to get the whole elephant, you know. So I've really theorized about the ears and trunk of the elephant, but not the tail or the legs or what have you. Well, so speaking of just looking at some parts of the elephant, there were parts that became sort of an obsession for later Confucian philosophers, Neo-Confucians. And they have to do with, I guess, two themes broadly construed. One I'm going to call automaticity, and the other I'm going to call, well, I think actually I can group them both under that heading, automaticity. So automaticity is a fancy way of saying it's referring to psychological processes where you're able to do things very quickly and automatically. So this connects with system one, system two cognition that we discussed in the Sprouts episode. So one thing that most human beings, not all famously, but most of us can do quite automatically is recognize faces. And it's, incredible actually how quickly you do it. You spot a face, usually within less than a second, you know who it is. If you were forced to describe what it is that's distinctive about their face, maybe you could say something. Maybe not, and yet you're still able to identify faces, pick them out of a crowd very easily and name them. Like, I don't know, maybe you could say, oh, this is a person who has sharp, well-defined eyebrows or slightly hooked nose or something. But of course, your brain is doing something much more sophisticated than anything that you could articulate through slow, plodding, deliberative reason. And it's doing it automatically because, you could be given images of 1,000 people with slightly hooked noses and sharp eyebrows, and you'd still be able to pick out the friend, Sam, that you managed to spot in a second. And so that kind of cognition where you're just quickly processing all kinds of visual cues to figure out whose face you're looking at, that's an automatic process. That's to be contrasted with these slow plodding forms of cognition where you're, applying some kind of decision tree and figuring out, like when you're doing a mathematical proof or when you're looking at the law and figuring out whether your course of action you want to pursue is legal or not, or what have you, or looking at a tax code.
So this is system two, as they call it, or Kahneman calls it.
Yeah, that's a clear example of system two. That's not so fast and frugal, the much slower, explicit reasoning. So the later Confucians were quite interested in the extent to which golden rule-like kind of guidelines for one's behavior could just become automatic, things that you do effortlessly, just like, facial recognition. And so they thought of automaticity as having two sort of distinctive markers. One is that when you're effortlessly able to observe the golden rule, not do to others what you don't want done to yourself, helping others establish themselves because you want to establish yourself, helping others succeed because you want to succeed. When you do that automatically, one marker or indicator of that is it's effortless. So effort is seen to be the opposite of automatic behavior. And so we would expect for people who are less than fully virtuous that it would be effortful for them to apply golden rule-like procedures or outcomes to their behavior. So effort is one important thing that they're tracking. And we'll start to apply that again to our two passages shortly. The other thing that maybe some philosophers will immediately know what I'm talking about, and others will have to do a little explaining, is whether you experience the golden rule as an imperative. That is, as something like a duty, as something you have to do, something you ought to do, right? If you do, if you think, this person needs help establishing herself, well, then is that consistent with the golden rule? Yes, it is. I want to establish myself and I rightly want to do so. So I should help her. And therefore I should, I must, or something like that. That's an imperative. It's a kind of mandate or requirement, moral requirement. If you experience the golden rule as an imperative, that's also a sign that it's not automatic. So I think you, the listeners, can probably see where I'm going with this. The sagely paradigm or model of empathizing is supposed to be one where you, first of all, don't have to apply any effort in order to care appropriately for other people. So you just, automatically or quickly, effortlessly want to help other people establish themselves and succeed and, comfort them when they're in great pain and have lost their job or what have you. And moreover, fully virtuous people don't experience it as an imperative. It's something they want to do. It's not something that they have to do grudgingly. It's not something they do out of a sense of duty. So those are the two issues that became theorized. And it is very much the result of a kind of close reading of the text. So the Chung brothers, who are the ones who kind of really thematized these issues, automaticity, effort, whether you experience the golden rule as an imperative or not, they looked at another passage in the Analects. I won't read it for you, but I'll just tell you. It's Analects 5:12, book 5, chapter 12. And there, a student sort of announces, it seems like he's announcing that he follows the golden rule. So he says something like, what other people don't want, I don't do, you know? And Confucius surprisingly says to the student, who's not a star student, that's something you haven't yet achieved, actually. You haven't yet reached that point where whatever you don't want, you don't do to others. And so the Chung brothers, among many other later Confucian philosophers, paid close attention to the Chinese text, the Chinese characters that were in his particular formulation in Analects 5:12. And they noticed that there was no use of an imperative word there. So when he says don't want, he uses wu, wu, wu yu. So it just means don't want. Whereas in the classic formulation of the golden rule, Analects 15:24, which you read, Richard, it uses another wu. This is going to be confusing for people who aren't used to the tones of the Chinese characters. It's the fourth tone wu. So the first wu that I just mentioned is the second tone wu, which means when paired with desire means don't want. Whereas in the classic formulation, it's the fourth tone wu, which means like a prohibition or an imperative, saying do not, right? Imagine an exclamation point behind that word. By the way, for readers of mostly modern Chinese, it might help to know that this wu I'm mentioning, the imperative wu, the prohibitive wu, fourth tone wu, is the same wu that you always see whenever you're anywhere where smoking is forbidden. You know, it says qing wu, xiyan, don't smoke here. It's the same wu. Don't use it in ordinary language, but it appears in certainly in formal writings, more kind of scholarly or literary writings, and also in signage. So anyway, the point is the Chung brothers noticed that there's a way of reading the Analects such that it suggests that if you can not do things to others that you don't want for yourself, without ever representing that as a rule that you should follow or you ought to follow as an imperative, that's actually superior in a way. This passage 5:12, which drops the imperative formulation, is meant to suggest a kind of higher level of achievement that his student hasn't yet achieved. So that's a really interesting claim in itself. And then the effortful thing, that's another issue. So this one I think is going to be of more interest to people who are concerned with reading the Confucian tradition, especially Confucius and Mencius, as being consistent and more or less on the same page with each other. So there is a passage in the Mengzi. It's the only one that mentions shu, actually, in the Mengzi. He doesn't talk about it that much, which is surprising. And that passage is 7a4, I think. It's one of the 7a's. We'll put it in the show notes anyway. And there he says that if one wants to seek out this really important virtue of humaneness, goodness, benevolence, nothing will bring one closer than forcing oneself to exercise shu. And he uses this word that's often translated as forcing or compelling oneself, that clearly implies exertion. So in order to read Confucius and Mencius as having more or less the same view about shu, the later Confucian philosophers, beginning with the Chung brothers, but others too, and the Chung brothers, I should say, are kind of the founders of Neo-Confucianism as we know it today, early Northern Song thinkers. They tend to say, yes, shu is basically an inferior alternative to the full virtue of humaneness. It's the aid or assist which you must avail yourself of if you can't just count on your own predispositions to help you live by the golden rule naturally, effortlessly. And here again, I think they would point to the fact that this word that's being translated as teachings, what is the one teaching? Zigong asks his teacher, right? That can serve as a guide for one's entire life. The word that's being translated as teachings is yen, which basically just means words. So what sort of verbal doctrine, what doctrine that you can formulate in words would you recommend to people? And so the Chung brothers look at that and they think, kind of thinking about rules or guidelines, things that you can actually state. And of course, for fully virtuous people, we would expect that they wouldn't have to spend a lot of time checking and asking whether they're conforming to the rules or not, right? They'll just desire to do the right thing, to do the virtuous thing.
Internalized the
Yes.
proper emotions and attitudes that just help them to respond properly in a spontaneous manner. And there
Yeah.
is something right here that, yeah, if you're doing something because it's a duty, often it's not as good as doing it out of, say, affection and love, right? I think we touched on this topic previous episode where, like, for example, if you
Yes.
visit a friend in a hospital and you're a good content, you go, well, I did it out of duty, so that's why
Yeah.
I'm here. Instead of saying, well, you just did it because you really wanted to visit your friend, to comfort him out of affection, out of love, out of friendship.
Yeah.
Those motives do seem to be proper, at least they do seem to be better motives. I was wondering, just to defend the Kantians a little bit, if there might be cases where it is better to do something out of duty or out of, well, I
Yeah.
don't know, for respect for the law, because it's required. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not a Kantian, so yeah. Or can you think of any examples?
Yeah. I mean, if you thought that sometimes you're in a position of like political authority where you have to enforce the law on someone that you actually love and care about greatly, like a, I don't know, a child or a family member or close friend or something, and you're a judge, I don't know. I mean, this
Hmm.
doesn't actually happen because we have conflict of interest
Hmm.
rules and procedures that prevent judges from judging
Hmm.
cases, their close friends and family members. But anyway, if you can imagine somehow you're kind of stuck having to figure out whether you're going to enforce the law consistently, even though it means punishing someone that's dear to you, we might
Hmm.
think that, yeah, actually acting out of duty is a better thing to
Yeah.
do. Yeah, I'm actually not so sure that the Confucians would disagree with that. So they do have this virtue of righteousness, E. And righteousness is basically a stable disposition and intelligent disposition to do uh, what's right, which is sometimes something like your duty, even when it's hard.
Hmm.
And for Mencius, at least, it's quite clear that the motivation is supposed to be a sense of shame. You would think it'd be shameful to do otherwise.
Hmm.
And so long as that's your motivation and it's wholehearted, I think you'd be okay with that if there's a bit of a conflict. That's another issue that we might have to discuss, like moral dilemmas and conflicts, because Mencius is very sort of famous for wriggling out of a lot of moral dilemmas and suggesting that there's some third path that allows you to avoid
Yeah.
argument.
And it seems like that's right. So, and there are things, it seems good that one thinks there are certain kinds of actions that you should never do, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
come what may, I'm not going to torture the innocent or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a good moral thought to have. Although I wonder what consequentialists might say. But yeah, certain thoughts like that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to act in a dishonest way or something like that. No, that's good.
Yeah. To sort of finish the story of the later careful, close readers of these passages, the Neo-Confucian ones who went on to philosophize. So there's the Chung brothers are these founders of Neo-Confucianism who were really interested in automaticity of the virtue of humaneness and whether people could just kind of automatically, unselfconsciously, it seems, behave as though they're applying the golden rule without actually explicitly applying it, not applying any effort to abide by the rule, not even representing it as a rule that they have to follow. So that's one issue that really was thriving, I'd say, for most of a century before Zhu Xi came along. Zhu Xi, again, is the most important Neo-Confucian, and I'll just spell his name for people because English speakers may not know. It's spelled ZHU, and that's his family name. Family name goes first in Chinese, traditional Chinese arrangement. And then his personal name is Xi, Xi. So he comes along and decides that he likes the Chung brothers. He follows the Chung brothers rather closely. He doesn't think they're right about everything, but he thinks they're right about most things. And he thinks this is a really cool and important distinction that he wants to justify, but he doesn't seem to be entirely satisfied that he understands the psychological mechanism. Why is it that when ordinary people are explicitly following the golden rule, it always has to be effortful, right? Why is that so closely linked with seen as an imperative? So he comes up with a theory which he says is consistent with their view, but they never explicitly articulated. So he's sort of explicitly saying, I'm developing their views, I'm building on their views in ways that I think they would agree with. And this is really interesting to me. I find myself dwelling on his distinction, Jushi's distinction, all the time. So his way of distinguishing between the ordinary person's empathizing and the sages or the fully virtuous person's empathizing is to say that it has something to do with how much significant thoughts about the self are required to elicit the empathetic reaction. I'll say it again. How much do significant thoughts about oneself, what do I want? How would I feel? if I were in their position. How much are those required to elicit the right sort of empathetic response? So he's paying close attention to the use of the first person pronouns, essentially, in the classical formulation. Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. And so the Chinese, of course, is ji, self, or what oneself does not desire. So that use of oneself, he thinks, is very important. It suggests, he thinks, that when you apply the golden rule as an ordinary person rather than a fully virtuous person, you're kind of leaning heavily upon your own self-interest, your own self-concern with your own well-being and success and failure in order to leverage, in order to motivate the right sort of response for others. That's, for me, quite interesting. And it tracks with a distinction that some psychologists, not most, just a few that are really careful, call other-focused and self-focused empathy. So if I'm trying to imagine my friend Xiao Huang, who's just lost her job and trying to figure out how to comfort her or console her, and I'm having to think, now, how would I feel if I lost my job? Or if I'm having to recall how I felt when I did lose my job, at some time in the past, that is self-focused empathy. But if, on the other hand, I just imagine, oh, how does she feel? Oh, she must feel terrible. She must be devastated. Without any significant reference to self motivating the appropriate response, that's other-focused empathy. That's what psychologists now call other-focused empathy. That's a distinction that someone named Ezra Stotland, he's a psychologist from the 60s, called imagine self, imagine other empathy. Nowadays, the few psychologists who care about the distinction call it other focus, self-focus. But anyway, I take Jushi to be onto a distinction that basically is very similar to that one. Maybe not exactly the same, but I'll read to you a passage that I translated in a couple of my papers where he distinguishes between the ordinary practitioner's use of the golden rule, or shu, right, as we see it in the classical golden rule passage, and the fully virtuous or humane person's application of sort of automatic, effortless, implicit application of the golden rule. So here is his description of how it works with if you're an ordinary practitioner of shu. And this is what I take to be self-focused empathy. That's what I take to be self-focused empathy. They take that which they find nearby in themselves and draw analogies to that of other people. For example, they themselves desire to succeed. They come to understand that others also desire to succeed, and then go on to assist others in succeeding. So you see, it's only after you've kind of figured out what you want and then imagine what someone else wants and notice that their situation is analogous to yours in various important ways that you then go on to assist. You're kind of only then are you finally motivated to go help others in succeeding. So that's ordinary person's application of the golden rule and ordinary person's empathy. Here is how it works for the fully virtuous or humane moral agent. He says, just by wanting to succeed, one helps others to succeed and does so without applying any additional effort. So I think what he's trying to suggest is maybe thoughts of the self enter in occasionally when you're an ideal empathizer, but they're not playing a significant role in motivating the right response, you see? That's a way of sort of explaining why it is that the ordinary person's empathy feels effortful. It's suggesting that it feels effortful because they're not quite there. They don't yet quite have the second nature, the predispositions, the motivational inclination to go help others without this little push or nudge that they get by imagining themselves in someone else's position.
Right. So the considerations of the welfare or interest of the other person gives a direct motivation and reason for a fully virtuous person. Whereas
Right.
the less than fully virtuous person, it's almost like there needs to be an extra step. So they need to kind of think about it in terms of their own desires to get
Yeah.
that extra motivation or how it would impact them.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is one way of putting it. I'm not sure if it's the right one. It's not enough just to see that the friend who's lost her job is despairing and has been destabilized and no longer has that sense of security that we all depend on. Somehow you still have to you have to remind yourself, oh, right, I should, how would I feel if I were in her position? And that's when you are then finally inclined to go comfort her and console her, or at least you now sort of appreciate in full depth and texture the misery she must feel.
Yeah, that's
Go
very
ahead.
interesting.
I can extract from Zhu Xi's writings two arguments. One is strongly implied, and the other one is just outright stated. So the one that's strongly implied is essentially this idea that you find all over a lot of the virtue ethical traditions that virtue is best when it's wholehearted. So this appeals to the same intuition you were talking about earlier, Richard, that if you're grudgingly going to see your friend or sister or sibling or family member in the hospital, that suggests that you're not wholeheartedly concerned about them. That's a sign that you're less than fully virtuous. Fully virtuous person would care about them for their sake, not go grudgingly. There might be other reasons why you might go grudgingly that have to do with, I don't know, conflicting moral demands or something. But anyway, just I'm feeling lazy or something is not a very good reason. And so it's not a very good sign of your commitment or your kind of your psychological character if you go grudgingly. I think Jushi is appealing to that notion that if you have to leverage your natural self-interest as an aid or an assist to help you to get to care adequately about others, that's a sign that you aren't a wholeheartedly humane person. Like I say, that's strongly suggested, but not quite. I think he's speaking to an audience that understands that wholeheartedness is an important feature of full virtue. There's a Chinese term that theorizes about quite often, cheng, sincerity, which is usually taken to entail wholeheartedness. It's a quality of all virtues. You can't really have a virtue in its fullness until you have it sincerely.
Mhm.
So that's one argument. Another argument that he does make explicitly is that, and this is really interesting to me, he seems to suggest there's something pernicious about self-consciously striving to be virtuous. And so sometimes he's imagining people adopting the golden rule because they're thinking, well, what would a humane person do? Or what would a sage do? You know, what would Kongzi tell me to do? And in those cases, you're thinking, how could I be a virtuous person under that description? That's your explicit object, right? Is you're trying to become a better person. And so he says, ideally, when you're humane and behaving in other regarding ways or other caring ways, your virtue of humaneness should be almost invisible to you. It should be, he says, like a belt or shoes that are so comfortable you don't notice them. I always find that a really interesting analogy. It says something about how belts and shoes must have been felt to people back then. So yeah, you should be so comfortable with your humaneness that you don't even notice it. You're not even applying the term or the concept humaneness to your own behavior. And it's an interesting claim he makes. It is the beginning of an argument, and one can imagine how he might spell it out. He might worry, for example, that if you are thinking about it in terms of how you can be humane, how you can be more virtuous, that means that you're very quickly going to start thinking about, I don't know, reputational concerns, or you're going to have delusions of grandeur, maybe. I don't know. It's like there's some sort of close psychological association between being a more virtuous person and being someone that is others respect and admire, which is a kind of selfish or self-centered motivation. That's one way of sort
Mhm.
of cashing out the argument. Another way of cashing out the argument that I play with is that maybe he just thinks it's a kind of contradiction in concept if you're striving to be humane under that description or self-consciously striving to be humane. Maybe in the same way that like being proud of being humble is a contradiction in concept. If you think, oh, I'm so awesome, I'm really great at being humble. I'm just such a humble person. You think, okay, now you've already shown that you're not humble because a humble person wouldn't brag about it. Maybe Jushi is suggesting similarly that like humane people, it's just the nature of humaneness that you're motivated in ways that have to do with, I don't know, other directed care or concern and not with being virtuous.
It
Oh, go
does
ahead.
seem though that like if you're not a fully virtuous person yet, then and you're striving to be a more honest person, let's say. I heard that one thing that could be effective in helping or motivating your students not to cheat is to say something like, well, if you
Yeah.
cheat, then you're going to become a cheater.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then you just leave it at that. Yeah, you might also get caught and so on. But
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
want to become a cheater?
Yeah.
And I think most people don't want to actually be a cheater. Yeah, and you might be striving to be an honest person. Like you think, well, what sort of person do I want to become? And you might think an honest, just and courageous person. Yeah, I mean, I guess when you act, you don't necessarily use those terms, but yeah, I'm not sure if
Oh, that's interesting. That's really
yeah.
interesting, Richard. Yeah, so I'm trying to remember the term. Actually, I'm married to a therapist and she sometimes talks about the danger of globalizing. I think that's the term. Maybe it's anyway, the point is being too quick to generalize about someone's character. It's dangerous, for example, in some cases to tell children that, oh, you're always so considerate, because then now they think they have this sort of global character trait they have to live up to. And maybe you don't always want them to be considerate. Maybe sometimes you want them to stand up for themselves, you know? So anyway, yeah, there's something that I want to call globalizing or generalizing going on when you call someone a cheater, which for me is quite effective. I didn't know that there was evidence of this, Richard, but I'm not surprised. Yeah. Yeah, I'm much more comfortable thinking back on the one time I got caught cheating in middle school or junior high. I'm much more comfortable saying I cheated
Right,
than
right.
that
Yeah.
I'm a cheater, or that I even makes me uncomfortable to think that I was a cheater then. I don't think of myself as someone who had the more global character trait of being a cheater. Yeah, I can see how that's quite effective. And so yeah, maybe there's something similar to say here, that like if you're trying to live up to some global character trait or generalized description, humane
Mm.
person or virtuous person or sage, that's problematic too. Like maybe the appropriate way to be motivated when you care about someone else is to be just sort of responsive to their particular concerns or angst or travails. Yeah, there are a lot of ways you
Mm.
can go with it, but I like the suggestion. So basically, to kind of reiterate, one line of argument that Jushi offers for thinking that self-focused empathy is a good assist or aid, but still inferior to full humaneness, understood as other focused empathy, is to say that it's just less than wholehearted. This also links up with your favorite philosopher to discuss, Aristotle, Richard, uh, who talks about mere continence as opposed to full virtue. Someone
Mhm.
who has to really try to, I don't know, be honest or keep a promise to a friend or something, is merely continent at being just or honest and not necessarily doesn't have the full virtue. I think the Confucian's Jushi certainly is tapping into the same general intuition. The other argument is one that's going to be very interesting for some of our listeners, especially those who listened to our episode on oneness, our interview with PJ Ivanhoe. So Jushi, he has a bit of a kind of ambivalent relationship with this idea in Neo-Confucianism, but he's still basically on board with the idea that when you manifest or instantiate the virtue of humaneness, you're seeing yourself as part of one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things. That's kind of a grandiose description of it in the best case, in these most encompassing cases. Just when you're caring about someone else, you form one body with them. When you care, when you care about your child, you're in some sense you're forming one body, which is a fancy way of saying you develop a sense of mutual identity. You see yourselves as part of a larger whole that you care about.
Mm.
And I say Jushi has some ambivalence. He's sort of two minds about this one body stuff because there is a whole thread or tradition that descends from the Chung brothers associated with this philosopher Yang Shi, Yangshi. And most of you don't need to know him really, but just know that there's this other trend that kind of overemphasizes the mystical sense of oneness in ways which Jushi finds, frankly, mystifying and misleading. But nevertheless, he thinks that at the end of the day, that is the right description of humaneness, that when you are humane, you see others as having some kind of mutual identity with you. You see you and others as belonging to a larger whole or one body. So obviously, you can see what movie's going to make here. He says other focused empathy is much more conducive to regarding oneself as one or one body with the other, whereas self-focused empathy is not so conducive. I've kind of spent a lot of time looking at the passages where he talks about this. I get the impression that he basically thinks as soon as you've represented yourself as someone who has some duty or obligation to help others, you're setting yourself up in opposition to them. Like you're starting to now see yourself. This is me really kind of extrapolating a little bit, but you're seeing yourself as in some kind of zero-sum game where what you gain is at their expense or what they might gain is at your expense. Maybe that's going too far, but the point is, he seems to read this idea that you have some imperative to take up the perspectives of others and care about their own establishment and their own success as you care about your own, maybe not as much, but that already is sort of representing you and the other as in some kind of fundamental opposition, as no longer being part of a larger whole. So anyway, that's a whole nother line of argument, which is for me really interesting and worth developing and thinking about. And again, it's all just Jushi reading the text really closely and trying to explain to his students, and to a certain extent in dialogue with his students, figure out what it must be like to be an ordinary practitioner of empathy who, as opposed to someone who's fully virtuous in practicing it.
Yeah, no, I really like this argument from the one body or kind of unity, or as there's something right about this. So if you really truly believed everyone, like you formed this unity, this everyone is, you're all part of the same whole, then if someone else is in pain, you don't have to take that extra step of going, well, what if I was in pain? Or, you don't even have to have that kind of thought.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
immediately more directly would be aiming to help if you truly had that kind of metaphysical picture. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, so again, I guess I'm more sympathetic to the self-focused empathy as kind of a stepping stone or a early developmental device. Again,
Yeah.
like if you're just like a 7-year-old, or maybe even earlier, I suppose, you need to start recognizing that, well, no, even though you don't enter into the skin of that kid feels pain if you make fun of him. So you shouldn't do
Yeah.
that. What if, he made fun of you? And so it seems like to me, a perfectly kind of human, practical, and morally effective or important part of the process of maturing and developing. So maybe I don't quite see it in
It's so
such a down
controversial.
way. Yeah, as Jushi, although he does seem to have a good point that, but if you're in a more developed stage, then perhaps you can bypass some aspect of that kind of golden rule thinking where you have to kind of refer to yourself. Maybe you don't have to do that anymore. And
Yeah.
that might be a good thing because you truly have thought of yourself as being of one body with others. But
Yeah.
still, like, I think even the self-focused empathy seems like a necessary part of the process.
Yeah. And I should be clear, Jushi also thinks it's, for the vast majority of people, it's a necessary part of the process. So
Okay. Okay.
apparently, Jushi, I just have to be faithful to the text here. Jushi joins a great many latter-day Confucians who just refuse to believe that the classical sages, the sages like Confucius himself and Yao and Shun, could be anything but sort of moral prodigies, just born that way, you know.
Mm.
So they think that some people are born fully virtuous, more or less,
That's
but
right.
they think the vast majority of us are not, and we
So
really have
he
to work.
reads that spiritual autobiography passage in a very different way, or
Yeah, he joins a lot of other commentators in thinking that the highest form of kind of sagedom is the kind that you're just born into. Some people are just born knowing
Mhm.
it, is his expression, which comes from the Confucian canon. There's a couple of passages that suggest that. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, they read the autobiography of Confucius, suggesting that he's basically faking ignorance, that he's retelling his story of slow, plodding growth and development up to the age of 70, so as to give people hope. In fact, he himself was already fully virtuous, but certainly by the
Hmm.
age of 15. But most of us are not. So we need inspiration. We need to think that it's still possible for us to get there by the time we're 70, like him. So Jushi does sign on to this view that Confucius himself was a moral prodigy, and he therefore didn't have to wait till he's 70 to be fully virtuous. So Confucius, on his account, maybe during a few kind of early years when he was at least having to expose himself to enough moral experiences to realize his genius, was maybe he had to apply shu. But for most of his life, he was able to just apply other directed. He was able to empathize with people in another directed way. I think even for Jushi, he would say most people are not moral prodigies, and so they do have to apply shu, and he's perfectly happy to accept that this is an inferior yet necessary for most of us step that we take towards benevolence or
What's interesting
goodness.
is, I suppose, if you're of a more of a contemporary sort of mindset with a bit more of an individualistic view, like, we're distinct persons. Someone might say, that's actually still better. No, I am not you, and you are not me. But isn't it still marvelous that I can care about you and empathize and be motivated still
Yeah,
to
yeah,
help you out? Like, what's so wrong about that, Jushi? But I guess Jushi would say, well, no, but that's not the perfected understanding of the reality, which is we truly are of one body.
yeah,
And so there
yeah,
is a kind of metaphysics there in the background, but a more contemporary liberal individualist might say, well, no, this is the reality is we're distinct persons, and empathy of the self-focused sort is perfectly fine. And that's actually, yeah, I
yeah.
guess if someone rejects the metaphysics, that's maybe the way they would go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have this later Neo-Confucian in the loose sense philosopher we talked about earlier, the one who wrote my dissertation on Dai Zhen. And I read him as really resisting the kind of mainline Neo-Confucian emphasis on automaticity and effortlessness. So he, in fact, I read him as resisting Zhu Xi's interest in other focused empathy. I think he basically thinks thoughts about the self never drop out. And I guess I would characterize the difference between Zhu Xi and this later critic of Zhu Xi, Dai Zhen, in the following way. I would say for Zhu Xi, self-focused empathy is the ladder that you eventually have to kick away in favor of other focused empathy. Whereas for Dai Zhen, it's a permanent ingredient of humaneness at all times, even in the fully mature humane. In the person with fully mature or developed humaneness, you're still going to be relying on some significant reference to self. And that's because he thinks that you can't really have humane concern or humane love of others without humane love of the self. That's one reason why I think Dai Zhen believes this to be true. The other reason is in a very terse, laconic passage that he doesn't really explain at much length. He reads that single thread passage we mentioned earlier, 1524. So the single thread passage, which we didn't read, but Richard mentioned it at the preface, I think. Confucius basically says that the thread has two parts. One is shu, empathy, empathetic concern, sympathetic concern. And the other is this thing zhong, which is often translated as loyalty or conscientiousness. And Dai Zhen says something really interesting about loyalty or conscientiousness. He says it's basically seeing other people as like yourself. And he implies that that's an important part of humaneness, is that you see other people as, I think what he's suggesting is having something like the same status as yourself, being able to make the same sorts of claims that you make.
Mm-hmm.
So some sort of awareness of that fact that you and others have the same status seems to be really important for humaneness. So yeah, I kind of read Dai Zhen as suggesting that self-focused empathy, in some sense, and we'd have to do some work to figure out what sense it is, never drops out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a more modern kind of thought, it seems, that Dai Zhen is speaking to, the equal worth or equal dignity or something like that, where that's the reason why I should be acting in a certain way towards you because of the fact that I wouldn't want to be treated in that same way. That's quite interesting. And so Dai Zhen, I could see that he would want to reject Zhu Xi's view there. I guess maybe the metaphysics, I would imagine he would have a problem with, or some aspect of it.
Yeah, someday I'm sure we'll have episodes on Dai Zhen, as he's dear to me. I think perhaps the thing that most people know about him is that he rejects the so-called high-flying metaphysics of the Song Confucians like Zhu Xi. He's looking for a way of explaining big metaphysical ideas and even normative terms like, virtuous or vicious, right and wrong, righteousness or lack thereof, in terms of more empirical phenomena like desires and feelings and people's natural composition, their kind of physiological composition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's another reason he rejects Zhu Xi's views.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so yes, these are such interesting issues. And for that reason, it pains me to say it, Richard, but I think we've gone on enough already that we should probably call it a wrap. Or is it wrap it up? I'm not sure what the idiom is. And say that we've introduced the issues well enough, I think, for people to appreciate the subtlety, the complexity of the later tradition, and hopefully appreciate that point that I like to make, that close reading yields or bears philosophical fruit for people. We won't be able to do justice to the issue of self-focused, other-focused empathy, but it's hopefully people have enough of a glimpse and taste for it that they can see where some of these debates might go. So if that's right, then I guess we'll say that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.